Welcome everyone to our Zoom virtual hour on the Macedonian cultural genocide, and to our audience watching on Facebook, welcome as well. Greetings from Skopje, Macedonia. I am Meto Koloski, president of the United Macedonian Diaspora, and honored to introduce a longtime friend and colleague in the global Macedonian human rights cause, Victor Bivell. After I introduce Victor, I'll turn it over to two passionate young ladies in the Macedonian community from Australia, Stefani Taskova Miteva and Elena Sekulovska, who are part of UMD's Young Leaders Program, Generation M, who will moderate today's discussion. Hello, Victor, Stefani, and Elena.
Hello,
Hi,
Miteva.
everyone. Hello.
Hello, everyone.
Welcome. Our discussion is quite timely given today's guilty verdict by Greek courts that the neo-Nazi political party Golden Dawn operated as a criminal organization. No surprise to us. We, the Macedonians, have been victims of Golden Dawn's attacks, physically and verbally, harassment and threats. Extremism and hatred have no place in a democracy, and today's decision, we hope, will also open the doors to Greece to finally recognize the existence of the Macedonian minority within their borders, and also recognize the damage the Greek state has done to the Macedonian community over the past 150 years. UMD hosted candle vigils before various Greek embassies and consulates in August to memorialize the victims of the Greek brutality and the Macedonian genocide. Victor has written on many of these topics, particularly on the Macedonian genocide. He is a journalist, editor, and publisher, and has been a magazine editor for 33 years and a book editor and publisher for 28 years. Victor's work has been in the fields of business, engineering, manufacturing, venture capital, private equity, and environmental investment. In addition, in 1992, he founded Pollitecon Publications and has published 13 books in English on Macedonian politics, history, human rights, and literature. In 1997, he established a Pollitecon.com website where he has published the online book Life in Aegean Macedonia, which is in current day Greece, compiled the first online listing of Macedonian communities around the world, published the online series The Treaties That Divided Macedonia, republished online the Macedonska Iskra newspaper that was published in Australia from 1946 to 1957, started the online free ebooks library, which currently has over 280 free ebooks, most in English, and produces the occasional newsletter Pollitecon Update. He also writes articles and commentaries on Macedonian themes. I am excited to report that soon UMD and Pollitecon will collaborate to publish free papers on the Treaty of Bucharest and its effects on Macedonia and Macedonian people. Thank you everyone for joining us. Victor, the floor is yours.
Thank you very much, Meto, and to Eleanor and Stephanie, and hello everyone, wherever you are. I just want to start by saying I think the topic today is so important for so many reasons, and it's key to what I do at Pollitecon. All the material that I've assembled over the years from various writers all feeds into this theme, and I really think the theme today, the Macedonian cultural genocide and the Macedonian genocide, are really the core of what the Macedonian community around the world needs to discuss and come to terms with. It's okay to argue and refute the Greek focus on ancient history and the ancient Macedonians. By all means, you know, there's a lot of mistruths and propaganda there that need to be challenged and refuted. But I think it's important to understand that that is not the main game for Macedonians. For Macedonians, the main game is modern history. And the key part of that modern history is the period from 1900 to 1950. So just briefly, I know most of you understand that, but I just want to go over it just to emphasise how important it is, we've got the Ilinden uprising, we've got the Greek terrorist bands invading Macedonia, we've got the First Balkan War, we've got the Second Balkan War, we've got the division of Macedonia, we've got, and the genocides that happened as part of that. We've got the First World War, the Greek invasion of Turkey, and then the population exchanges and the colonisation of Macedonia. We've got the Metaxas dictatorship, we've got the Second World War, we've got the formation of a Macedonian state that's now the Republic of Macedonia, and we've got the Greek Civil War. Now all that in 50 years, and there's so much history there, could keep universities and academics busy for centuries. But they're the key events that have changed the Macedonian people and made us what we are, and put us where we are today, which is dispersed all around the world. And sorry, I forgot to mention there's also the mass migration from Macedonia that happened during that period. So I just want to emphasise how important I think that period is, and I'm very happy for this opportunity to discuss it with everyone.
Victor, it's great to have you on board, and thank you to everyone for hopping on and joining today. We're saying that, let's jump straight into our first question. Raphael Lemkin first coined the term genocide in response to the systematic policies during the Holocaust and other instances in history where specific groups of people were deliberately targeted. Although international law and conventions, such as the Convention on the Prevention and Punishment of the Crime of Genocide, does not specifically refer to culture or cultural destruction as an element of genocide, Lemkin initially included culture as a component of genocide. Why is culture so important, and more specifically, why did the Greek, Serbian, and Bulgarian states target elements of Macedonian culture, such as our language, throughout the 19th and 20th centuries? Do you think the Macedonian culture posed a threat?
Yes, it did pose a threat in the sense that with the geopolitics that was going on at the time and the desire of these countries to take over Macedonia, the fact that there was a separate people with a Macedonian culture, Macedonian identity, Macedonian religion, Macedonian language, history, and so on, was a threat to them. So this was not terra nullius. This was, some of the earliest lands that were settled in Europe. They had to. So it did pose a threat from that point of view, particularly because they made it quite clear from the beginning that their goal was to assimilate the people, and they can do that in several ways. But they could also see the culture on the one hand as a threat, but on the other hand, it's also a treasure. If you can imagine the map of Ottoman and Macedonia just before the start of the Balkan Wars, it took in Thrace, Macedonia, Kosovo, Albania. It was a very large area, and there was a rich culture there. It was a multicultural country, so there was the Macedonian people were there, I believe, as the largest ethnic group, but there were other ethnic groups there, and all of that culture there was a treasure also, as well as a threat. There was so much richness there. So you have the economic assets of the land, the people, and then the cultural assets. The countries divided the land, but they dealt with the issue of culture by either suppressing it or assimilating the culture. And that division of assets is still going on now. So, for example, we saw, with the Prespa Agreement, we saw the Zaev citizen government, give free rein for Greece to claim Alexander as Hellenic. And now we have the Bulgarian government claiming Goce Delchev as Bulgarian. So that division of labour, of culture, is still going on. And we also have to now add to that mix Albania, which got its independence at the time of the Balkan Wars, and is now also wants part of the spoils of Macedonia and the Macedonian people. So yes, I guess I would summarise it as a threat and also a treasure.
Yes. Can you give us a historiographical timeline of the Macedonian cultural genocide as is taking place since as early as the Ottoman Empire, then throughout the 20th century?
Yeah, look, having said just, we need to focus more on current history. I'll start by just mentioning ancient history. Look, I've always been very curious as to why there's so little has survived of the ancient Macedonian language, fragments and words and phrases and so on, bits and pieces, and why that is so, particularly when so much of the Greek, ancient Greek culture survived. And I did once ask Professor Victor Friedman, who's an expert in this area, if it were possible that there had been some destruction of the ancient Macedonian language and the artifacts that held it. And he said, it's very possible, but there's no evidence for it. So that's still an open question. But where the evidence does start is just over 800 years ago, excuse me, with the destruction of Slavonic language manuscripts, church manuscripts and so on. So Professor Friedman there refers to an academic, Vladimir Moshin, and I'll just read you a short quote about what Professor Friedman said about that. He said, essentially the situation is that although manuscripts were being produced, none have survived from 1180. So Professor Friedman in an interview said, up until the article, that's Vladimir Moshin's article, quote, people had been saying it was the Turks who destroyed everything, but there are Greek language manuscripts from this period that survived in this region, whereas Slavic ones did not. And it is not as if the latter were not being composed in an organised way. The Ohrid Literary School, which began in the late 19th century, is just one place where manuscripts were being written in large numbers, which means the Greeks have been trying to destroy Slavic culture and literacy for a very long time. So that was, over 800 years, referring to events over 800 years ago. But that is the start of the evidence, but unfortunately it doesn't stop there, particularly when it comes to books and so on. So with the closure of the Ohrid Archbishopric, there was also large-scale destruction of Macedonian books, and Nick Anastasovsky in his book, The Contest of Macedonian Identity, 1870 to 1912, writes about this, and this is one of the reasons. It was a PhD thesis, fantastic manuscript, and the bit I want to quote from you is one of the reasons why I published it. It's very powerful. And Nick writes, following the abolition of the Archbishopric of Ohrid, the Macedonian Church was annexed to the Patriarchate of Constantinople, which took ecclesiastical control of Macedonia, and in place of native bishops of one interest with the people, Greeks were sent from Constantinople. Greek bishops and metropolitans reinforced Greek religious domination in Macedonia by attempting to wipe out traces of the Macedonian character of the Archbishopric of Ohrid. They set upon destroying centuries-old books, records and religious texts, and often replaced Macedonian church inscriptions with Greek. In monasteries on the holy mountain of Sveta Gora, the Greek clergy acted drastically, throwing old Macedonian parchments into the sea or burning them in furnaces. And at the monastery of St. Nome at Lake Ohrid, the Greek prior Dionysius burnt the manuscripts. In Prilep, there was a burning of the religious books, whilst the books stored at Veles were destroyed in a bonfire in the marketplace under the orders of the Greek bishop. As much as 300 kilograms of parchments and religious books belonging to the Ohrid Archbishopric were lost forever. I mean, books lost forever, one-off manuscripts, just tragic. So that was another turning point. But again, it was not the end. It was not the end. The destruction and the suppression continued, and it picked up momentum, if you like, with the founding of the Greek state and later the founding of the Bulgarian state, because then the suppression was done by governments which have far greater resources to implement their policies. And we saw that then with around that time with a fairly large-scale denationalisation of the Macedonian people. So the Greek government and the Bulgarian government and other people knew what they wanted to do in Macedonia. And so we saw the denationalisation of the Macedonians. So they were, referred to as Slavs or Macedonians as Christian Macedonians or Christians from Macedonia. So we have this in the creation of this absurd situation where we had a country called Greece with Greek people. We had a country called Turkey with Turkish people. We had a country Bulgaria with Bulgarian people, a country Serbia with Serbian people, a country Albania with Albanian people, and a big hole in the donut in the middle called Macedonia with no Macedonian people. How absurd is that? How utterly absurd is that? But that's, the suppression that they were peddling, and they're still peddling that today. The governments there knew what they wanted to do. And I'll just read you one more quote just to show you what was meant there. Back in the, before the turn of the 19th century, the 20th century, the then Greek Prime Minister Trikoupis was quoted as saying, when the Great War comes, Macedonia will become Greek or Bulgarian, according to who wins. If it is taken by the Bulgarians, they will make the population Slavs. If we take it, we will make all of them Greeks. So the suppression was picking up speed. And then, of course, we had the Balkan Wars, which were the major events. And we've been living with the consequences ever since. So after the Balkan Wars, we had the colonisation, we had the changing of the names of people and places, we had the suppression of the Macedonian language and of Macedonian culture. And somewhere out of all of that, they managed to, by a small miracle, emerge a free, independent state. But again, the suppression continues with all the troubles that the Republic of Macedonia is having in developing its Macedonian culture. So yes, that's a bit of a timeline of the suppression.
Thank you for that, Victor. The Macedonian genocide happened during an already tumultuous time in European and Balkan history and politics, being targeted left, right, and center, not just metaphorically, but literally speaking. Why was Macedonia targeted? Or perhaps, why has Macedonia been referred to as the gateway into the Balkans in Europe more broadly? And how has this influenced the events of and leading up to the Macedonian genocide?
Yeah, look, there were some key geopolitical events going on at the time, at least 3 or 4. So let me just go through them briefly. The first one was the slow decline of the Ottoman Empire, the so-called sick man of Europe. All the countries in Europe knew that the Ottoman Empire was coming to an end, and the question was, what would be the shape of the Balkans post the empire? And of course, being a period of imperialism, everyone wanted to expand their spheres of influence. So the decline of the Ottoman Empire was a key one. The second one was that the Western powers wanted to limit Russian influence in the Balkans. They wanted to stop Russia getting a seaport, a warm seaport in the Balkans. They wanted the regime or that would emerge in Macedonia not to be aligned with Russia. So they wanted it to be friendly to the West. A third key factor was while the Ottoman Empire was declining, so was the British Empire. And the British Empire had a lot of territories throughout the Mediterranean, but the so-called jewel in the crown, India, wanted to preserve its sea links, and that was through the Suez Canal. So it was in Britain's interest to have a number of states and proxy states and friendly states throughout the Mediterranean. So, it had Egypt and Cyprus and Greece and Gibraltar. And if there was going to be any division of territory, it wanted to reinforce its power there. So we saw a steady accretion of Greek territory during that period, some islands and Thessaly and so on. Adding Macedonia to Greece made sense for the British as well. And I guess a fourth one was, in a sense, you know, if I can put it this way, the failure of the Macedonian intelligentsia to win the support of a key Western backer. You know, the fact that Albania emerged in 1912, while, you know, during the Balkan Wars, you know, with the backing of Italy, you know, it was a great success for Albania. You know, that's good for them. But the Macedonian intelligentsia leadership were not able to achieve that. I guess that's partly because our people then, we'd had 500 years of Ottoman rule. You know, our people were farmers, they were peasants, they were non-educated. You know, the Ohrid Archbishopric had been closed. The schools, you know, were Greek schools, then later Bulgarian schools. So they're not to educate our people, but to propagandise them. You know, the Ilinden uprising failed, which alerted everyone to what was going on, or more so. And so our people were unorganised and failed to, or didn't have the backing of a Western power. So there are a lot of geopolitics, you know, big geopolitics going on at the time. I guess what we can say is that, you know, what happened with the Balkan Wars and the division of Macedonia, you know, suited the West, and the Western powers, you know, saw it, were part of it, and in that sense they were witnesses to it, and in my opinion, silent accomplices to the genocide and the cultural genocide. And that's because it suited their geopolitics. Yeah, I'll leave that one there.
In terms of research and data, it can be said that there is a lack of this in regard to the Macedonian genocide. As students, we have both found this in our research for essays where we use Macedonia as a case study and use these opportunities to even teach our professors about what happened to the Macedonians and Macedonia. However, that gap nonetheless exists. So how can this gap in academic literature and research be filled? And perhaps, is this necessary in gaining international recognition of the Macedonian genocide?
There is a gap, spot on. Absolutely no question about it. I think that's probably the most important thing we may talk about today. And the key gap is looking at those events from a Macedonian perspective. So filling this gap can only help to raise awareness and to increase recognition of the Macedonian genocide. There's some information out there, certainly enough, you know, a considerable amount, but there are plenty of gaps, and all those gaps need to be researched. So that means we need more historians, more writers, more students, more research to take an interest and find out about what happened. Now, the best time to have done that would have been during and after the Balkan Wars, when we had people, you know, living witnesses there, people who lived through it and could give first-hand accounts. Unfortunately, you know, that's just out of our living memory now in the last few years. But we still have living memory in the accounts of people, of the children and grandchildren of those people, and also in the documents from the period. So it's not too late. It's never too late. So what I would really like to see, I would like to see a centre for the Macedonian genocide, an academic centre set up, you know, and, you know, with good historians, good writers, good researchers, and to write about it from the Macedonian perspective. And three key things would be, of course, you know, to go through all the and document all the available literature, all the available films, all the available photography, and look at that from analyse it from a Macedonian perspective, and then also to commission new research, you know. And this is something I wanted to do when I started Pollitecon. My idea was to have a successful publishing company where I had a good sized budget and I could commission writers and tap people on the shoulder and say, you know, here's a year's salary, go and write me a book about this, or go and make me a film about that. But unfortunately, the reality I soon discovered was that publishing for a small group like Macedonians, let alone doing it in English, which is even smaller, was not a commercial enterprise. So, but nonetheless, that's a lot of what Pollitecon is about. But I think we can step it up a level in the academic area with some, you know, a group of serious academic researchers to just put all the evidence out there and then examine all of it, critique that evidence which is biased against the Macedonians, and create new, research and create new evidence from our point of view. So, and again, within that, I'm not micromanaging, but you can see I'm very interested in it. But what I'd again like to see is an analysis of the destruction that occurred during that period. And I would like to see it battle by battle, town by town, village by village, and if possible, you know, the names of all the people who were killed. You know, now there are some stats out there, but they're not reliable. And I mean all people, not just the Macedonians, because the Macedonian genocide is different from other genocides. It's not a one-on-one genocide. It's not the Nazis against the Jews. It's not the Serbians against the Bosnians. We have 5 armies in the battlefield: the Turkish army defending, and then the attacking armies of Greece, Bulgaria, Serbia, and Montenegro. They're in a large multicultural territory. They're not in a monocultural territory. So we had the Macedonian people, we had the Turkish people and the Muslims, we had Greek people, we had Bulgarian people, we had Serbian people, we had Albanian people, we had Vlachs. You know, Macedonia was a wonderfully multicultural country up until 1912. Just hard to imagine how wonderful it is in such a racist continent like Europe, that even today, 100 years later, still practices assimilation and cultural suppression. So Macedonia was a treasure that had the transition from the Ottoman Empire occurred properly, would have left us with a wonderful multicultural treasure, perhaps a bit like Australia and Canada today. But unfortunately, that didn't happen. So we need that analysis of what happened to the Macedonian people. But being Macedonians and being multicultural, naturally multicultural people, which I believe we are, let's include everyone. So, you know, everything and everyone who suffered in that territory. So yeah, that's what I'd like to see. Over to you.
In order to prove that an act of genocide occurred against the Macedonian people, it is essential to prove genocidal intent. And then, so now linking back to that gap within academic literature, do you think we will have any difficulties proving genocidal intent?
None whatsoever. It's already there. It's already there in the Carnegie Report, which was written at the time of the Balkan Wars. It's already there in the other literature that was written at the time. People know there was a genocide. That's what shocked Europe. That's why they had the Carnegie Report and other research into it. So there's no question there was an act of genocide and cultural genocide. Look, I'll just read you a section of the Carnegie Report just to give you a flavour for how shocking the events of the time were. Again, I was looking at it again last night, and I went to bed shaking my head. You know, it's just so tragic. I mean, the report uses words like extermination, devastation, massacre, murder, destruction, and so on. There's no doubt, and race hatred and others. There's no doubt about it. So let me just read you this quote. Quote, "The object of these armed conflicts, overt or covert, clearly conceived or vaguely felt, but always and everywhere the same, was the complete extermination of an alien population. In some cases, this object expressed itself in the form of an implacable and categorical order to kill the whole male population of the occupied regions. We are in possession of some letters from Greek soldiers of unimpeachable authenticity. These documents, though written in our own day, throw back to the time of the Assyrian conquest. Quote, "We have taken a small number of prisoners and them we have killed, such being the orders received, in order that the dirty Bulgarian race may not spring up again. We are to burn the villages, massacre the young, and spare none but the old people, children and minors," unquote. Here the intention is clearly to spare none but those no longer capable of carrying on the race and those still young enough to lose their nationality by receiving a Greek education. So no, there's no question in people's mind about what was going on. But there's two courts here. Sorry, the Bulgarians did similar. That was the Greek game. The Bulgarians did similar, and so on. But there's two courts. There's legal courts and there's the court of public opinion. Now, in a legal court, that's where you try the people who committed the crimes, and so you have a very high bar of evidence and proof. So, for example, we saw that at The Hague with the trials of Slobodan Milosevic, Radovan Karadzic and Ratko Mladic for the acts of genocide in the Bosnian War. Now, there were many acts of genocide there, but the main one was the massacre at Srebrenica, 8,000 people. Now, I've found it hard to get statistics on the number of people killed in Macedonia during the Balkan Wars. It's easy enough to get the military statistics, but civilian statistics are very hard, obviously, because a lot of people are dead and a lot of people fled, and it's not in the interests of the armies to collate those statistics. However, there is the most recent one that I saw was I'll just find it for you. Was an academic, Justin McCarthy, who's written the book Death and Exile: The Ethnic Cleansing of Ottoman Muslims, 1821 to 1922. And in there, he says that during the Balkan Wars of 1912-13, 632,408 people were killed and 812,771 people were made refugees. Now, the International Encyclopedia of the First Balkan War puts the total military deaths at 238,500. So on my rough calculations, the number of civilians killed is about 400,000. Now, no one out there is giving us as far as I'm aware, is giving us a number for the number of civilians killed. But this, as far as I can work out, is as good as any, if not the best so far. Now, 400,000 is an extraordinary number of people, So you can imagine, had there been a Hague at that time, had there been a genocide convention at that time, just about every political leader in the southern half of the Balkans would have been put on trial. Those people have all died, so they can't be put on trial. So there will be no Hague, as far as I can see, for the perpetrators of the Balkan Wars. But as I said, there's still the court of public opinion. And that is still active, not just for us, but for other genocides as well. We see it perhaps most vividly, perhaps at its highest profile, with the Armenian genocide, where that is still getting a lot of publicity, and with the help of a lot of Greek nationalists, who are doing it for propaganda reasons against the Turks. But nonetheless, that's a live issue, and there are other genocides around the world that are going on and have gone on. The Native American genocide, for example, is I think another one that is deserving of a lot more attention. So the Macedonian genocide is still there in the court of public opinion, and that's, I think, where we can do a lot of work. Now, that doesn't stop. The fact that there won't be a trial against the perpetrator doesn't stop resourceful academics and interested researchers putting together the case against those perpetrators, against those kings and prime ministers, against those generals, and against those policies. Please, someone out there, do that work, put that case together, and then instead of presenting it to a Hague, you can present it to the court of public opinion. You know, I really just can't overemphasize how important I think that task is of educating the Macedonian people and the rest of the world about the Macedonian genocide and what happened there. And of course, that very much ties in with the previous question about the gaps in the data and showing the intent. So I might just leave it there with that question.
Yeah. This next question relates to something that I have a personal interest in and a huge passion for. It is also something that inspired a paper that I wrote here in Macedonia that is currently pending publication. It is also a topic that unfortunately has not gained much attraction and acknowledgement, which is why Elena and myself felt that it would be important to incorporate into today's discussion. Victor, in feminist analyses of war and conflict, women are sometimes referred to as mothers of the nation or symbols of the nation, as their roles tend to be associated with childbearing and rearing, being a wife, a mother, and hence having the biological power to reproduce a cultural or ethnic identity. Indeed, one of the books you have published by, and pardon my pronunciation if I mispronounce this, the name of the publisher was, or author, apologize, Lefa Ognenova Mitrova and Kathleen Mitsu Lazaridis. The book was called The Girl from Neret. It touches upon this topic, referring to the Greek state's attempts to spread the Greek language and culture, prohibiting the speaking of the Macedonian language and enforcing compulsory Greek language classes in villages, which many Macedonian women had to attend. Noting that this angered the men as it was an insult to the Macedonian identity. Would you agree that women were central and targeted in the attempts to destroy one culture, the Macedonian one, and promote the other, the Greek one?
Yes, absolutely. Macedonian women are central and were targeted. And look, thank you for mentioning A Girl from Neret. It's a wonderful book. When I read it, I just knew straight away I had to publish it. And that book and the other one by Pandora Petrovska, Children of the Bird Goddess, are two books that I've found really speak about women's issues and speak to the heart of women. And I've had so much positive feedback from women as well as a lot of men, but particularly women about those two books. Yeah, look, the Carnegie report makes it very clear, you know, that the intention was to spare no one but those, you know, who can't carry on the race. So very definitely women were targeted. And as you read the Carnegie report, you know, the acts of violation against women figure very prominently, and you know, in their thousands. You know, so certainly women, you know, were targeted and have been targeted, and one of the reasons is, of course, the you know, the primary role that women play in passing on the culture and the language. I don't think it's an accident that we call our language our mother tongue. It comes from our mother, because our mother is the first to speak to us and teaches us the language. So while Dad is out there, you know, doing what, you know, earning whatever, you know, to support money or growing crops or whatever it is, Mum's, you know, teaching and passing on the language and the culture, and assimilationists know that. And I recall seeing a document put out during the 1980s, or that was written in the early 1980s, ostensibly by the Greek government, and they talked about how to denationalise the Macedonians in the Ledin region, and there were at least two measures there that relate specifically to women and targeting women, and one was language and the creation of early childhood centres, so that infants and very young children could go to these childhood centres and spend time there learning the Greek language, rather than being at home with their mum or dad or Baba and Deda and learning the Macedonian language. The other measure was to encourage intermarriage between Greek soldiers who were stationed in the area and Macedonian women in the area. I don't know how you particularly go about that, but I do know that there have been some marriages between Greek soldiers and Macedonian women in the area. So yeah, look, that's 3 examples, of how women are targeted, have been targeted and are still targeted. And all of those need more research. So it's great to see, people, interested in those areas and wanting to write about them, go for it.
To continue from the last question, in her book, Anastasia Karakassidou undertook field work in villages near Solun, which were victims to the initial Hellenization of Macedonia in the 19th century. She speaks of how the Greek colonists were evidently more privileged than the native Macedonians, as they were business owners and merchants, whereas the Macedonians were second, if not even third-class citizens. As a result, Macedonian men married off their daughters to Greek men, hoping they will have a better life. In such situations, she notes that the women were prohibited to speak Macedonian and that thus their children were raised as Greeks. Would you classify this as a form of cultural genocide?
Yes, of course. Assimilation that involves suppression of the original culture is cultural genocide. There's no doubt about that, and there's also no doubt that the Christian Turk colonists, who we now call Greeks and whom the Greek government now calls Macedonians, even though they've only been there 100 years, that they were privileged, and there are many stories of how they were economically privileged. When I visited my village a few years ago, we were driving from the plain to Ledin. A relative of mine pointed to the fields and said, when the Prosfigi came, they were given land here and told to grow tobacco, and we were up the road and we were prohibited from growing tobacco because, so they could have a market. So they were privileged that way, and then their children then went on and became public servants, and we're still here as farmers and peasants. So that's on the ground now. So yes, how you handle the women and how you handle the children, absolutely. And another technique from that period was relates to Queen Frederica of Greece. During the Greek Civil War, she set up camps ostensibly for abandoned or orphan children during the war, but other people say that some of the children were kidnapped. And we know that many, if not most of them, were Macedonian children, including the children of the partisans, and they were raised as Greek children. I know of a couple of instances of these children. I've spoken to one who grew up in one of the camps and told me how he was raised as a Greek, but he knows he's Macedonian. Now, the numbers are a bit variable, but they say up to 25,000 children, so a lot of Macedonian children in those numbers, and many were not returned to their families, and a lot of them were adopted out to American families. So, they weren't given back to Macedonian families. So yes, a lot of those have been lost to Macedonia and to their relatives. So yes, for certain, that's a form of cultural suppression and assimilation. And if some were kidnapped, then that could also be a form of a Macedonian version of the stolen generation in Australia. And now, the Queen Frederica's children were different from the child refugees, but the intent seems to be the same. When they knew the civil war was lost, General Vafiatis and the Greek command issued the order to evacuate the children. Now, most were Macedonian, but there were also some Greek children. But of course, later, the Greek children, when they grew up, were allowed back into Greece, but the grown-up children, when they grew up, were not allowed back into Greece. So that's ethnic cleansing. And I've heard other stories from Macedonians, I've already discussed that point. So yes, there's a whole range of techniques for cultural suppression and genocide. And as you say, intermarriage and the children is definitely right up there. End of that question. I hope. Well, I hope it's research. So no, let me paraphrase that. It's not the end of the question. Let's hope it's furthering that question. Let's research that question more. But the end of my response to that immediate question.
Within Macedonian historiography, we often emphasize the Macedonian genocide that was conducted by the Greek state. Do you think that we also need to start having a conversation on the cultural genocide and ethnic cleansing imposed on the Macedonian people by the Serbian state from 1912 to 1940, especially considering that this is still a taboo within the Republic of Macedonia?
Yes, by all means. We need the full picture. And we can include Bulgaria's suppression of Macedonian culture to the 3 invaders and the mass murders of the Balkan Wars. Everything should be investigated. We need to know more about what happened in the Serbian part of Macedonia while it was occupied, not just for its historical value, but for respect for the families. The people need to know what happened to their relatives, what they went through, and pass that on to their children. It becomes part of their life. I mean, it's fortunate that with Macedonia's independence, the Republic's independence, the worst part of the suppression of that part is over. So a lot of it will be academic. That may make it a little safer to investigate because the main Serbian oppression now seems to be related to the lack of recognition of the Macedonian Church. Otherwise, in recent times, compared to Greece and Bulgaria, Serbia seems to have come a lot further down the right road. But, if a topic is taboo, look, I'm a journalist, by definition, it needs to be investigated. So, and I'm sure plenty of academics feel the same way.
What do you think the role of the Greek, Serbian and Bulgarian Orthodox Church were in the Macedonian genocide?
Very unchristian, very, very unchristian. Look, they've played a key role in the suppression of Macedonians and Macedonian culture, and I've already talked about, the Byzantines and the church manuscripts and the closing of an Ohrid archbishopric, but it continued on. The denationalising of the Macedonians started immediately. And then we had the priests were involved in that. They were involved in the Bulgarising of the Macedonians and the Serbinising of the Macedonians. And in the Elandin and pre-Balkan War period, they were involved in terrorist activities. So we had, the Greek Bishop of Castoria, Germanos Karavangelis, and there have been other priests who get a mention in the Carnegie Report and other places. So, the role is huge. And the irony here, the cruel irony, I guess, is that, Macedonia was the entry point for Christianity into Europe. And yet, the Christian church is, one of the chief persecutors of the Macedonian people. So look, from a personal point of view, I don't see much Christian love and I don't see much Christian self-sacrifice from these churches and these priests. I'm religious. I try and be spiritual, but I've got no time for this type of religion. It's a personal view, but for me, these men in black robes are just religious bureaucrats, I think they're an anachronism. Who needs them? Certainly, I think the Macedonian church doesn't need them. They may want their recognition, but they don't need it. The Macedonians are already recognised in the Bible. What higher authority is there? I would. Well, like everything, let's investigate them and let's create the full picture of what they've done to the Macedonian people.
Just before we go to our final question, I just wanted to touch upon a project which a few of our Generation M representatives have done, which touches upon this cultural genocide and then the religious element, and then how the religious minority rights affecting Macedonians today, specifically in Greece and Bulgaria. We had Generation M. We had a team which put together a report titled Eliminating Intolerance and Discrimination of the Macedonian Orthodox Christian Minority in Greece and Bulgaria in response to a call for a submission for the United Nations Human Rights Council Special Rapporteur. We will actually be releasing a press release about this really soon, as it's an ongoing project and research project, I'd say. Nonetheless, I wanted to make a quick comment here and I guess also highlight the importance that although certain injustices may have occurred previously, I think that it's really important that we have passionate young Macedonian youth who are continuously, how do I put this, seeking justice for our community, not just for events that happened in the past, but events that are going on today, which are as a result of those events that happened in the past. And I'd like to say that I guess we are slowly but surely achieving some change.
Absolutely.
So just moving on to our final question here. I'm sure, Victor, that you, as well as many of our viewers here, are probably aware of, there were statues this week in Macedonia which had plaques put up in front of them claiming that these statues and figures now belong to the ancient Hellenic history and civilization, which ties into our final question. Has the cultural genocide of Macedonia and Macedonians ever really ended? Many would agree that now it's just taking place in a different light.
No, it's definitely not ended, definitely not. The cultural suppression is everywhere, and it almost always comes from Greece and Bulgaria and their accomplices and apologists in the West. And we know what's going on, the so-called name dispute. It's not a name dispute. It's a failure to respect Macedonia's name and its right to self-determination. There's a failure to respect the Macedonian identity. There's a failure to recognise the Macedonian ethnic minorities in Greece and Bulgaria. There's the failure to respect and recognise the Macedonian language. There's a failure to teach the Macedonian language, the failure to recognise the Macedonian church, and so on and so on and so on. The cultural oppression is alive and well, and we're living in it as we speak. So, but instead of getting respect, we get this massive propaganda campaign and the manipulation of international politics to further that agenda. So yeah, we really need a strategy to counter that. My strategy is one of the strategies in terms of the Republic. I think it's been hijacked. It's been hijacked by the Western powers, who are obviously friends of Greece and Bulgaria. They've got a very compliant government, a compliant opposition, and I would really like to see the Macedonian people take it back. The Macedonian people are good people. What they want to do with Macedonia is good. It's not a threat or a danger to anyone. This threat, the idea that it's somehow a threat to Greece is ridiculous. The only thing it's a threat to is Greek mythology about itself. The only thing it's a threat to Bulgaria is to Bulgarian mythology about itself. If you're a Christian countries, remember what Jesus said, the truth will set you free. So why be afraid of the truth? So the Macedonian people are good people, and I believe if they took back control of Macedonia, they would make everyone proud of Macedonia, and Macedonia would be a good international citizen. So how do we do that? Well, look, I really think if you want a homeland, you've got to have a majority Macedonian population. And Macedonia is a multicultural country, and we need to preserve that and keep it as an example in the Balkans of how multiculturalism can work. But it also has to have a strong enough Macedonian component that component is not under threat. We need to remove that threat so it's a secure homeland. And I think we do that, by encouraging Macedonians to continue their links with Macedonia or re-establish their links with Macedonia, whether it's visiting, buying products from Macedonia, developing the culture, whatever it may be. There's a whole range of things people can do there. I think we just need to encourage people, Macedonians everywhere, to get involved and make some sort of contribution, whatever that may be, whatever suits their talents and abilities and budget and interests, but to make a contribution to the survival and strength and growth of Macedonia. And I think it's only then when Macedonia becomes strong enough that the bullying will stop. The bullying is going on because it's weak. We're the smallest kid on the block. But if people can see that it's a strong country and that it's doing good things, I think gradually the bullying will die down, hopefully one day end. Sorry.
Moving. Yes.
Oh, sorry. No, I was going to end there.
Oh, okay. So moving on to the audience questions. We have a question from Lauren Danforth, who asks for reactions to Prespa Agreement, in which the Greek government recognizes that the existence of the Macedonian language and the fact that the nationality of the majority of the citizens of the Republic of Macedonia is Macedonian/citizen of the Republic of North Macedonia.
Well, look, I'm not a fan of the Prespa Agreement. I think it was, it may have solved a problem for Greece, but I think it solved very few problems for the Macedonian people. It certainly solved none of the problems for the Macedonians in Greece, or Bulgaria, or around the world. So what recognition there is of the Macedonian language is qualified. What recognition there is of the Macedonian identity is qualified. It's not good enough, you know. I recognise the Greek people as Greeks. Whether they're related to the ancient Greeks or not, to my mind, is irrelevant. Whether the Macedonians are related to the ancient Macedonians or not is irrelevant. It's not part of my Macedonian identity. My Macedonian identity is because my people, my forebears, come from Macedonia, and that identity was passed on to me by my grandparents and parents. And by the way, I've done a DNA test that shows I'm also a native of the Balkans. You know, so why is the recognition in the Prespa Agreement qualified? You know, it's not good enough. Simple as that. And I don't see, you know, the Greek propaganda machine around the world suddenly reverting to calling the Macedonian language, or the Macedonian people Macedonians. You know, the persecution may have been dialed down a notch, but it hasn't ended. So I think the Prespa Agreement was a massive failure by the Macedonian government. I think they had diplomatic tools at their disposal where they could have got a much stronger agreement. I think the original idea when they started to renegotiate was that it would coincide with entry of Macedonia into the EU. That hasn't happened, so now we've got what I call the Franco-Bulgarian veto. You know, had the Prespa Agreement gone through with Macedonia's entry into the EU, there would have been no room for Bulgaria to blackmail us. And then when the French president said no to Macedonia commencing talks, the Bulgarian blackmail started. So that's why I call it the Franco-Bulgarian blackmail. So it's just death by 1,000 cuts. You know, they just want more of that Macedonian treasure. I think the Prespa Agreement should be consigned to history. I believe negotiations with the Greek government should happen, but they should happen as equals, and they should result in an agreement that ends the problems for both countries. And that includes recognition of the Macedonian identity everywhere, recognition of the Macedonian language everywhere, recognition of the Macedonian church everywhere, and so on. And in return, you know, if I was a negotiator, I would allow Greek to keep Aegean Macedonia, the land, but to operate it as a multicultural area where all minorities are recognised, the Macedonian, the Turkish, the Muslim, the Albanian, the Vlach, all of them. Let's create it as a, you know, let's make Macedonia what it always was, even under Alexander the Great, a multicultural country. It's only a monoculture under Greece and under Bulgaria. So I believe a settlement can be reached. It may take a bit of education and a few years to get people used to the idea, but I think a fair agreement is possible if we have good leadership there, which at the moment we don't. Sorry to end that comment on a poor note, but you know, Europe has a very poor habit of throwing up high quality politicians, but it has done one or two in the past. So, you know, a Mahatma Gandhi or a Nelson Mandela or Abraham Lincoln of the Balkans, you know, may be able to do the job. As a positive note to end on.
The next question is from Robert Nucius, and he says, "Hi Victor, thank you for starting Pollitecon Publications. It's a great resource. Do you think that Greece will ever adopt the Treaty of Lisbon, which I think was the resolution signed in 2009 by the EU on minority human rights and freedoms?"
Well, Greece has a very poor record on human rights agreements. You know, again, another area of infinite research for academics and journalists. Look, it's only going to happen if there's a change of mindset amongst the Greek people. Unfortunately, what happened was there are good people out there, but unfortunately the nationalists, Greek nationalists and the extreme Greek nationalists have hijacked the debate there, they've hijacked the media there. So there's, you know, we saw that from 1992 with the independence of Macedonia, how one-sided the debate was there. We didn't have free voices, you know, or sorry, we did, but they were small and oppressed. So the great majority of the discussion, the debate, the agenda is run by the wrong people there. We need to change that. We need to investigate the Greek media, who runs it and what their agenda is. We need to encourage, I guess, the establishment of new and independent media that's not afraid to speak out, that's not afraid to call Macedonians, Macedonians, and Turks, Turks, and to talk about human rights for all of the minorities that are in Macedonia. So that's a longer term project, but there are good Greeks out there. We need to, you know, encourage them, I guess, but ultimately, you know, it will only happen if I think if there's a mindset change within the Greek people, or someone in the West, someone in international politics uses a big enough stick against the Greek state, which hasn't happened at the moment up until now.
We've got quite a few questions coming through, which is great. The next one is from Vera Sekulovska. She says, "The examples of cultural destruction that you are referring to are mirrored in what is happening today. Why are these inactions still enabled even with international support?"
Well, that's what this whole discussion is about. You know, how can we stop that? You know, I guess step one is making people aware of it. You know, I mean, one thing that really worries me is the normalisation of hate speech. You know, the fact that academic literature is full of references, not to, when I want to read about a G Macedonian, not to Macedonians, but to Slav speakers, or, you know, Slav Macedonians, all this other terminology that denationalises, dehumanises my people, and makes me wonder who I'm reading about, whether I'm reading about my family or not, my people or not. So a lot of that cultural genocide has been normalised, and we need to point it out as hate speech. You know, we need, and then people will become a little bit more aware of what's going on, and, you know, hopefully gradually by, you know, bit by bit, they will stop using it. I mean, we've had that previous examples. There were terms for Australian Aborigines and terms for African Americans that were very common that we no longer use, and there are alternative terms now that you know, people use. And same with Macedonians. Terms like Slavs is insulting. It's so dehumanizing. It's like talking about Greeks as Indo-European speakers, because that's their language group. You know, well, let's do that for a while and see how they feel. You know, they won't like it. So that's why we don't do it. We need that respect. So we need to stop the normalisation of hate speech amongst Macedonians. And I've got a list of that. in an article I wrote recently called, about the Greek vocabulary of cultural genocide. And that's, so we need to make people aware there's a huge vocabulary. Stop its use in academia, stop its use in the media. That's step one. And the hardest part will probably be stopping its use in the Greek media. And that's why we need alternative, better, ethical media in Greece. And there's a lot more that can be said about that.
Charles Galileo says, I find it difficult to find evidence of the affirmation of our nationality in the 1800s and prior to that, say 1700s, 1600s and 1500s, etc. Is there much to confirm our existence?
I'm sorry, I'm not sure I quite understood the question. Are you saying you're not seeing a lot of affirmation of Macedonian identity in those periods? I'm assuming that's the question.
That's correct, Victor.
Okay, thank you. Yeah, it's there. It's there. Look, you've got to remember, it was not a literate people. You know, education for the masses didn't start till only a couple of hundred years ago. So, you know, our people and most people in Europe were peasants, uneducated and illiterate. So the amount of literature that was around is very limited. And as we've seen, our literature, a lot of it was destroyed as well. But there are references amongst the literate people of the time to Macedonians. And I know I'm recalling a book where someone has gone through and documented a lot of that evidence. It may be on my website. I'd have to research, but I've definitely seen a book that lists a lot of historical references. But look, again, let me give you a personal example, not going that far back, but you know, I'm from the village Neret, Latinsko. I recently wrote an article called Neret Families. It grew out of research into my 4 grandparents in my family trees. And I ended up just last month, so posting the article. It's got about well over 300, nearly 400 photographs of Neretsi from around the world. They're gravestones and portraits of Neretsi who've died. Now, a lot of them from Faulkner Cemetery in Melbourne, some from Karrakatta Cemetery in Perth, some from our village, and some from America. Now, the interesting thing about this is that a lot of those people would have been illiterate, but on their tombstone, invariably, particularly in Australia, they have the name of the person, Roden vo selo Neret, Macedonia. The great majority, that's what they say. Some may say Neret, Greece, or Polypotamus, but the great majority say Neret, Macedonia. And these are, you know, people who were not educated. So, and again, it goes back to the donut, the Balkan donut, you know. How is it that all these countries, Greece, you know, Bulgaria, Serbia, Albania, all emerged from the Ottoman Empire with people who had those identities, and yet somehow there's a question over whether the big hole in the middle in Macedonia didn't have that identity. Of course it had that identity. People knew who they were. I remember my grandfather, you know, born about 1910, speaking to me about Gruzia and Bulgaria and Serbia and so on. And they knew who the surrounding countries were. To think that they didn't know who they were is just absurd, you know. So the evidence is there. We just need to look for it more. And perhaps that's why, as referring back to one of the earlier questions, when the Greeks took over Macedonia, the claims of cultural genocide that people make include covering over and painting the churches, the Macedonian writing on the churches, and destroying Macedonian tombstones. And look, this is something I put to the Macedonian people around the world. When I visit my village in Aegean, Macedonia, I can't find, or haven't yet found, a tombstone of anyone buried before 1912. Plenty of people buried after 1912, and all the tombstones are in Greek. No tombstones before 1912. But of course, I know those people were there. We were there for centuries, if not millennia, because I've done the DNA test, and I know my people have been there up to 11,000 years in the Balkans. So where are these tombstones? You know, let's go through all the villages there and let's see if there are tombstones of people buried before 1912. Let's see if they really were destroyed or if some survived. So yeah, look, again, the question you're asking is open-ended and it's going to create a lot more academic work for researchers.
The next question is from Charles Galileos, who says, Nikola Gruevski claimed that he was under pressure to resign and accept a compromise with Greece. Is this correct? Is the entry into NATO and EU a priority now? And then we can write back the one-sided Prespa agreement.
Well, look, I'm in Sydney, Australia. Nikola Gruevski was in Skopje, Macedonia, so he would know much, much better than me if he was put under pressure. If he said he was put under pressure, I don't doubt it. I'm sure, pressure has been exerted for a long time in various, on various political players there. Look, the fact that he managed to, not give in to a lot of that pressure says a lot about his character and his political leadership, and that's good. And how all of that collapsed with the Zaev government. I guess what we need is, leadership there that can either withstand that pressure or is intellectually and politically and diplomatically creative enough to create new options that can satisfy the political people putting the pressure, but still satisfy the objectives of Macedonian people. As to whether, well, we're already now a member of NATO. Whether it was worth it, no, I don't think it was worth it. As a friend of mine said, Zaev gave up everything just for NATO. If he'd given up maybe a little bit and kept a bit in reserve, a bit more in reserve for EU, that would have been a lot smarter. But so no, I don't think it was worth it. Is it worth it for EU membership? Well, again, it depends what we have to give up for EU membership. Obviously, the identity is a red line that no one wants to cross. And what do we get in return, apart from just membership? So again, if this is the Franco-Bulgarian blackmail I was talking to you about, who knows what will end up, or some puppet leader in Macedonia may end up giving up, to get into EU. But unless it's a very good deal for the Macedonian people and solves these issues around genocide and cultural genocide and identity, no, I don't think it's worth it.
The next question is from Belinda Delios, and she says, you said that Greeks wiped out and changed Macedonian words on churches and etc., and they were changed to Greek. What do we say to the Gurkomani that replied that the Bible was written in Greek? And then she says, I think that the existence of Macedonia relies on the diaspora. More people in Macedonia seem defeated.
So it seems to be two questions there. The Bible was written in Greek. Well done. I believe it may also have been written in Hebrew. Or whatever the languages around at the time. But these were international languages. So we're speaking English, but we're Macedonian. What does that prove? Am I suddenly a Germanic speaker? Am I suddenly related to the people in Germany? What does it prove? Apart from the fact that Greek was an accepted international language. Sorry, can you just remind me about the second part of the question? About the diaspora?
Yeah, I can read it out again. I think that the existence of Macedonia relies on the diaspora. Most people in Macedonia seem defeated.
Look, absolutely. Look, certainly the people in Macedonia seem defeated to me. They seem to have lost heart. It was only 2 or 3 years ago we had those massive demonstrations against the Tirana platform. And then something, even more important, I guess, or just as important, there was nothing, So, I certainly get that sense that they're dispirited and disheartened. And certainly I also believe and have believed for a long time that the survival of Macedonia and the growth of Macedonia belongs to the diaspora. It's in our hands. There are more Macedonians outside Macedonia than inside Macedonia. That's not right. The English and the Irish and other people can afford it because they have a relatively large, and some have a large homeland. So, although the number of people who left there is numerically large, percentage-wise it's small. But the amount of people who left Ottoman Macedonia and, from particularly from 1900 to 1950, just massive. And again, there was another wave from the Republic after that in the 1970s. So, you know, the Macedonian diaspora needs a strategy to help Macedonia to strengthen it. And, you know, the small bits that I can do is publishing. Happy to do that. You know, the My Macedonian Needs Macedonians campaign to encourage people to improve their links with Macedonia or re-establish their links with Macedonia. Go and visit, re-establish contacts with people who maybe even visit often or even live there or retire there. But there are so many other things that can be done. It's a community, a collective effort, and it's up to people to decide for themselves what contribution they can make and then go and make that contribution.
The next question is from Robert Nucius, and he says, how can we keep the Macedonian language and culture alive and thrive in Aegean Macedonia when Greece won't even allow Macedonian cultural centres to open?
Yeah, good question. I mean, you know, look, I think on the one hand, we have to accept that the Macedonians there are bilingual in the same way I live in Australia, and, you know, English is my primary language of communication. I need it for work and so on. In the same way, the Macedonians there need to have Greek. They need to speak it well and be literate in it to get work and so on. And the parents know that, you know, so look, I don't have a problem with that. The issue is the other side of the coin, maintaining Macedonian as a home language or as a second language. And we have that issue in every diasporic country. We have that in Australia with our children. You know, I know the language because although I was born in Australia, my parents, Macedonian was my parents' first language. So that was my, you know, Machin Yazik, my mother tongue. And then somehow I learned English. I don't know how, but I just did. But I've had trouble maintaining my Macedonian. My children, it's even worse now because we speak, you know, mostly English or virtually all English at home. So that's an issue around the world, not just for Aegean Macedonia. Look, we're looking for strategies. You know, the internet is a great strategy, a great step forward for all oppressed people around the world. You know, so there are online Macedonian courses. You can visit people. And look, you find when you go there, they do still speak Macedonian at home. They do still speak it in the towns and villages. They're not literate in it. So perhaps encouraging literacy would be a step forward, you know, literacy in Macedonian. Then they could really seriously improve their Macedonian. Again, it's up to the individual if they want to learn, you know, the Macedonian alphabet, then it's very easy to go forward because I taught myself to read Macedonian. I knew the words, so I taught the alphabet and taught myself the alphabet, and once I could sound out the words, I knew the words, you know, masa, oh, table, I know it, and oh, this word and that word, and it was really exciting for a while because suddenly I could read the words that my mum and dad and Baba and Della used to speak. You know, so there's, again, if we think about it seriously, there's probably a range of techniques and strategies we can use. We just need to formalise them and get it out there to the people.
To piggyback off the previous question, one thing that I find tricky is bringing awareness to our own people. I find that many younger Macedonians in Greece no longer identify as Macedonian, don't speak the language, and some are even very strongly anti-Macedonian. What do you think can be done about this forced assimilation, and how can we bring awareness to ethnic Macedonians in Greece about their own history?
Yeah, sorry, you froze during part of that, so I'm not sure I got all the question, but I think the question is about people in Greece and Macedonians in Greece and elsewhere who identify as Greek, and what can we do to encourage them or help them to reconnect with their Macedonian roots. Yeah, look, that's another live and very good question, and it's again, you know, around the world with the Macedonian diaspora. Again, look, there's no one silver bullet for that, but I think a couple of things that help. Look, I think criticising them doesn't help, if I can start there. You know, it's a negative approach and may encourage people to withdraw. You know, excuse me, they are what they are through the politics of the time and whatever their particular family history may be, and we don't know that family history. But look, having an independent Republic of Macedonia was a great step forward in that regard. And making people, Macedonians, proud of their Macedonian heritage is, again, a huge step forward. Having both of those in tandem, a homeland and being proud of your Macedonian culture, you know, then these Grekomani and Bugamani and so on, you know, we'll look and say, well, you know, part of the reason they may have become Grekomani is because they were fed the propaganda that they were, you know, second-class citizens, that they were just Slavs who spoke an idiom and not real people who spoke a real language, you know, whereas if they went over to the Greek side, they could, you know, pretend that they were related to the glorious ancient Greeks and so on. So we see that in Australia as well, you know, with the natives. You know, I think a solution to the raising up the Aboriginal people in Australia is making them proud to be Aboriginal, and part of that is making non-Aboriginal Australia proud of its Aboriginal history. And in the same way, you know, we need to spread the pride, if you like, you know, and so that where Grekomani want to reconnect, or where there may be something that they can reconnect with, you know, they can. So, yeah, look, that's a live issue. You know, let's develop some strategies and let's not criticise them. Let's understand them and encourage them to come back.
And the last question is from Angelique Soklev-Tezevsky, and she says, a Macedonian Cultural Genocide Centre would create something or somewhere where there could be no denying of what happened. Do you think this would perhaps help elders mourn or provide a sanctuary to reflect?
It would certainly provide a place where the elders could tell their story, and you know, a corollary of such a centre would be a museum. So here in Sydney we have a Jewish museum, you know, we have one in Macedonia and so on. So the Jewish people have been very, very proactive. You know, let's learn from them. They're wonderfully literate, wonderfully educated, wonderfully cultural people. You know, so if we had a centre for Macedonian culture, a museum is the next step. And I know of at least 2 fantastic activists in Australia, you know, who would love to set up a Macedonian museum and already have a great number of objects and material that they could put into one. And so I'm sure there are other people in other countries. So why can't we have, you know, a Macedonian museum in Melbourne, and, you know, another one in Toronto, or wherever around, you know, wherever there's a reasonable size Macedonian population. And the centre itself, you know, would be able to provide material for that. But I guess the other factor about the centre is the cathartic role it can play. You know, that there are still old people who have, you know, traumatic experiences, and they can tell those experiences, have them recorded, you know, feel that those experiences are listened to and valued, and that they're passing something on to their children and grandchildren. You know, absolutely, there's a huge role that a centre for the Macedonian Genocide could do.
Victor, a big thank you for joining us and delving into this very difficult topic. Thank you to the audience on Zoom and on Facebook, and Metal for organising this event, Elena for co-moderating with me. We would like to host more of these events, and we need your ideas, so please feel free to send any ideas you have through to us. And also consider donating in support of UMD and Generation M so that we can continue our work, especially during difficult COVID times. So thank you to you all once again, and we hope to see you all very soon.
Thank you.